Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Live with Mel.
This episode is brought to you by Yellow Cab Company of DC. If you're looking to avoid rideshare prices, then check out the Yellow Cab Company of DC when you are in the nation's capital.
Tension is still rising in Eastern Europe. Tension is rising. Russia is still seen as a threat, and many are still concerned that Russia is trying to invade Ukraine. They still have their troops, about 100,000 troops at the border. And while they're trying to deal with things diplomatically, many people feel as though diplomatic talks are not working at the moment. Now, because of that, the U.S. has decided to send troops to Eastern Europe. Now, the U.S. is very adamant that they're not looking to actually fight Russia if Russia does go into Ukraine, but they do want to send assistance. They want to send aid. But many are seeing the U.S. as sending troops to Eastern Europe as preparation for a battle, for some type of conflict if Russia does enter Ukraine. Now, again, at the moment, the United States is saying that they are not going to fight if Russia enters Ukraine, but they are sending troops in order to help their allies, NATO allies around Eastern Europe. Now, Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby said that the move is going to be to Poland, Romania, and Germany. So while they're sending troops, while the U.S. is sending troops to Eastern Europe, they're not necessarily sending the troops to Ukraine. They're sending it to surrounding areas to provide help and resources. So again, that's Poland, Romania, and Germany. And then John Kirby stated that they're sending it because of the current security climate and that these are not permanent moves. And then Kirby continued to say that the U.S. forces would not enter Ukraine. Now, they're sending about 2,000 troops into Eastern Europe, again, to deal with the current security climate. And they're sending the troops to essentially be backup for their allies in the area. And Kirby continued to say that the troops are not going to be fighting in Ukraine. Now, the U.S. is saying that now, because, again, Russia has not invaded and they're trying to stop Russia from invading, but they are sending the troops, and they do have other troops on standby, about 8,000 troops on standby to go into the region if something does break out. But Kirby is continuing to say that they will not be fighting in the Ukraine. Now, the 2,000 troops that they'll be sending over to Eastern Europe are coming from Fort Bragg in North Carolina. So they'll be there to essentially assist. Now, the United States is not the only country who essentially is stating that they're going to send troops over as well. France has decided that they're going to send troops over to assist with NATO. So they're going to be sending the troops to NATO in order to secure the area. Now, Western countries, again, they're trying to secure the area. They're not necessarily sending troops into Ukraine because, again, they're trying to avoid a conflict. At this time, the United States and its Western allies are trying to avoid any type of conflict that could break out, and they're trying to do things diplomatically. But since diplomatic efforts have not been good at the time, it looks as though after these diplomatic talks that happened yesterday, that the Western powers that be are sending more and more troops to the area because they do believe that something could break out. Now, this is causing more and more tension in the area. And then Vladimir Putin has continued to say that he's not trying to invade Ukraine at the time, but he is still making the same demands that he made before. Essentially, Putin does not want the Ukraine to join NATO at all. As we all know, the Ukraine is looking to join NATO. They want to be part of the allies in NATO. They want to be members of NATO. And Putin is very much against that. Now, one can speculate that one of the reasons that Putin is against that is because, one, Putin still views the Ukraine as part of Russia and eventually wants to invade and take over Ukraine and reabsorb them into Russia. Now, the other aspect that Putin may not like about the Ukraine joining NATO is that if you are a member of NATO, if your country is a full-fledged member of NATO, then if you are attacked, then all the allies come to your defense. So if Ukraine does join NATO and Russia tries to attack Ukraine, essentially he'd be facing all the members of NATO. Now, NATO, the Western allies, do not seem to be caving to Putin's demands, which is essentially breaking down diplomatic efforts. Because again, Putin is making demands. Another demand that Putin made is that Putin does not want to be personally sanctioned. And they said that if Putin is personally sanctioned, that they will see repercussions. So the Western world would see repercussions if countries try to sanction Putin personally. Now, again, they've been trying the diplomatic efforts. They've been trying to talk to Russia. The United States met with Russia yesterday, and the UK met with Ukrainian officials on yesterday as well. They're trying to stop this from being a conflict. They're trying to stop it from being a war. However, we are now seeing more and more troops move into Eastern Russia in case something happens. Now, while this is very smart defensively to have the troops prepared in case Russia does start to move into Ukraine, many people are saying that it's causing more and more tension in the area. However, the surrounding countries are happy. They're happy that the allies are coming and putting troops there. Putin, on the other hand, is not happy about the troops coming in from the Western world into Eastern Europe. And Putin has continued to say that the Western world is what's causing the tension, that the Western world is causing the tension and the fear in Ukraine. Now, Poland's defense ministry, Błaszczak, wrote on Twitter that the U.S. deployment to his country is a strong signal of solidarity in response to the situation in Ukraine. So the surrounding countries, including Poland, are happy that U.S. forces and other Western forces are coming in, and there's also NATO troops in the area. Now, while the U.S. is continuing to say that they will not fight in Ukraine, that the service members being deployed over there are not going to be fighting in Ukraine, the United States has continued to send aid to Ukraine. A few weeks ago, they sent lethal aid, which is essentially arms, so guns, rockets, weapons to Ukraine to help Ukraine be able to defend itself in case Russia does come in. And we know that if the troops are close enough to Ukraine, if they're in Eastern Europe, that if something does break out, that the United States may change its tune. And the fact that the United States saying that they're not going to fight in Ukraine may just be a diplomatic ploy in order to show Russia that they're not interested in fighting, thus keeping Russia happy, essentially, but also having the troops there in case something does break out. Now, with all this happening, tensions are still growing in the area. Tensions are very much growing, and many people are weary about what could happen. Now, Prime Minister Boris Johnson did meet with the Ukrainian president, but he did come out and he did say that Russia is essentially putting a gun to Ukraine's head. And many people do agree with that sentiment, that essentially Russia is putting this pressure on Ukraine. Now, it seems as though most countries, the Western allies, NATO and Ukraine, are trying to avoid a war. But it does look as though all of it is falling back on Russia and Putin and seeing what Russia and Putin are doing. No one wants a conflict. No one wants to go to war. However, with the way that things are developing, it looks as though the Western world is preparing for war. With the Western countries now deciding that boots on the ground is something that they are willing to do, it looks as though they're seeing that war could possibly be inevitable. As the days go on, we're seeing a lot of the Western world change its tune and sending troops in, with France and the United States being the two newer countries sending boots to the ground. Now, while they're sending boots to the ground, it's not in Ukraine. And I think they're doing that to keep tensions lower, so Russia doesn't feel as though everyone is preparing for war against it. But they are sending these troops to the surrounding countries. They're sending the troops nearby in order to essentially prepare for war. And again, no one wants to go to war, but it looks as though we're preparing. So at this time, we can compare it to essentially the Cold War, where everyone is on pins and needles with Russia because they don't know what Russia is going to do. And while no one wants to go to war, it looks as though Ukraine and the Western world are preparing in case Russia does attack. Now let's go ahead and go to the comments. Joanna says, we can't ignore what is happening on another continent because it will affect us one way or another. But in reality, the United States has no business at the moment to be part of a war. And I know a lot of Americans feel that way because it's not on our continent, it's not in our country. However, if Russia does start invading countries that used to be part of the USSR, it could eventually drag into and pull into a world conflict. The United States is in a position where they're trying to stop that from happening because, again, it could be devastating to the world economy. It could be devastating to the U.S. economy as well. And it looks as though the United States is going to try and stop it before it turns into a major conflict. Now, I know, again, many Americans have that same sentiment that Joanna has, where we can't ignore it, but it's not on our continent. It's not our problem. But it could have dramatic effects on the economy, on natural resources as well. There's a lot of reasons why the United States does need to help defend Ukraine if it is attacked. Again, something else that is very important is the natural resources that Ukraine has and the major pipeline as well, which essentially moves the natural resources, which moves the oil. The United States does have a lot of vested interest in this situation. And if something does happen, many people are going to look to the US to step up and help again. Because if Russia is successful in, again, this is speculation, if Russia is successful in invading Ukraine, it's not going to stop at Ukraine. It's going to go after other countries as well and growing and growing and growing. And other countries are going to look for help as well. Russia wants to return to the power that it once was. Let's be honest, Russia is still a world power, but they don't have the same power that they had decades ago. And Putin is trying to bring Russia back to its previous glory. And one of the ways that Putin wants to do that is by essentially invading and reabsorbing countries that used to be part of the USSR. He wants to see Russia be that great again. And if that happens, we don't know how far Russia will take it. And that's another reason why the United States is so invested in this. Now, while all this is happening, while the tension is being put out there, we are seeing that there has been some leaked documents, allegedly. So El País has got some leaked documents. We're still waiting on these documents to be verified 100%, but they did say that they have leaked documents that came out from the meeting between Russia, the United States, Ukraine, and the UK as well. And it's really information about the conversations that we're having and the diplomatic efforts that are going on at the moment. Now, in this document, essentially it says the US offered disarmament measures to Russia in exchange for de-escalation of military threat in the Ukraine. But it doesn't look as though Russia is happy about that arrangement, and it doesn't look like they're going to go that way. Again, Russia is looking for one thing and one thing only. And the big thing that they're looking for with their demands is essentially a written agreement from NATO stating that they will not allow the Ukraine to join NATO. And it looks as though Russia is not going to be happy, that Vladimir Putin is not going to accept anything less than a written agreement between NATO, the countries that are in NATO, and Russia that states that they're going to bar the Ukraine from joining NATO. Now, it doesn't look as though the Western powers are going to be okay with that. It doesn't look as though NATO members are going to be okay with that. And again, NATO cannot allow Russia to dictate who they allow in to the alliance. Because the moment that they give that power to Russia, they are limiting their own power. It'll put Russia in charge of a lot of different things. And while no country, except for Russia, wants to go into any conflict at the moment, they also cannot allow Russia to dictate what they do and who they allow into the allegiance. Now, again, there has been these leaked documents, allegedly leaked documents. I am still waiting for verification, but El País has released these documents and information about the documents. They released it yesterday, and it really did contain information about the diplomatic efforts that did occur over the past couple of days. But it doesn't look like it's going well. It does not look as though the diplomatic efforts are working. Now, the United States and NATO, according to these leaked documents, rejected signing a bilateral agreement on security in Europe, with Russia and also closing the door on future incorporations of Ukraine into the Atlantic Alliance. So again, the United States and NATO did reject this. They did reject this offer. And in the leaked documents as well, Washington complains that Russia made certain demands that undermine principles Russia has committed in prior documents. So with the breakdown of the diplomatic efforts, with things not necessarily going well diplomatically with the countries meeting, because again, the United States met with Russia and the UK met with the Ukraine, and it doesn't look as though anything was settled during that point. And that is one of the reasons why the US has decided to send troops to Eastern Europe. At this time, conflict, whether it happens or not, really does fall onto what Russia decides to do. Russia's making demands, Putin's making demands, and it doesn't look as though NATO and the United States are going to agree to the demands that Putin is making. It doesn't look as though things are going to go Putin's way. And we just have to wait to see how Putin will respond to that. There is a lot of pressure on Putin right now, with NATO allies sending in troops, including the United States, to Eastern Europe. Russia now has to decide whether they want to invade Ukraine and take on the Western world, or whether they're just going to continue to essentially intimidate and kind of fall back. I'll keep you guys updated about what's going on in Eastern Europe and with Russia as well. Many people are still on edge. And like I continue to say during this entire broadcast, it seems as though no one wants a conflict and no one wants to go to war except for Putin. And if Putin does invade the Ukraine, it is possible that the United States will be entering into a war in Europe. And even though Kirby has come out and stated that United States soldiers, that the US military will not participate in any type of war, any kind of conflict in Ukraine, it is very likely, it is highly likely that if Russia does invade Ukraine, that the troops will move from the countries that they're in Eastern Europe into the Ukraine to help defend the Ukraine. So guys, let me know what you think in the comment section below. Let me know what your thoughts are about the conflict and what's going on. Do you guys agree with President Biden's recent sending of troops? Again, he's sending 2,000 troops into Eastern Europe. Do you guys agree with what Biden is doing, or do you think that the U.S. should stay out of this conflict? Again, this conflict could potentially affect the entire world if any type of battle or if anything does happen. So let me know in the comment section below. My name is Mel. I come live every single Monday through Wednesday to bring you guys current events and let you know what's happening across the globe and right here in this great nation as well. So let me know what your thoughts are. Your opinion matters. If you agree with me, that's great. Let me know in the comment section below. If you disagree with me, that is great as well. Let me know in the comment section below, and let me know what your thoughts are about the U.S. sending the 2,000 troops into Eastern Europe to essentially deal with the security climate at the moment. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and I will see everyone next week. Have a great rest of your week and a great weekend. And this has been Live with Mel. Have a great day, everybody.